Welcome, everyone, to Coming Home to Yourself, Flourishing in the Field of Medicine, another event in our Contemplative Medicine Conversation series with faculty from our year-long Contemplative Medicine Fellowship. My name is David Iozzi. I'm the Director of Studies here at the New York Zen Center for Contemplative Care, and I'll be facilitating tonight. Today, Sensei Koshin Sensei, one of the co-guiding teachers of the Zen Center, and as well as the fellowship, are joined by Dr. Judson Brewer, one of the fellowship faculty members since our first year 3 years ago, and favorite faculty member of our fellows. And today we're going to be talking about what it means to stay at home with ourselves, even amidst the responsibilities and challenges of practicing medicine. First, just a brief introduction of Dr. Judd and Sensei Koshin for those of you who don't know them. Dr. Judd Brewer is an acclaimed psychiatrist, neuroscientist, best-selling author, and thought leader in the field of habit change. He has over 25 years of experience in mindfulness training and related scientific research, and he's the Director of Research and Innovation at the Mindfulness Center and Associate Professor in Behavioral and Social Sciences and Psychiatry at the Schools of Public Health and Medicine at Brown University. He is also a research affiliate at MIT and has developed and tested novel mindfulness programs and studied the underlying neuromechanisms of mindfulness. His most recent book is Unwinding Anxiety: New Science Shows How to Break the Cycles of Worry and Fear to Heal Your Mind. And he's here tonight because much of his work, although it's very broad, much of his work does focus on bringing contemplative practices to clinicians, both physicians and other healthcare professionals, to support them in the challenges of practicing medicine. And I think most know Zen teacher Sensei Koshin. He's a Jungian psychotherapist and author of numerous books grounded in Buddhist wisdom and practice, and often focusing on contemplative care. His latest book is Untangled: Walking the Eightfold Path to Clarity, Courage, and Compassion. And together with Sensei Chodo, who unfortunately couldn't be here tonight, he's sick, they co-founded the New York Zen Center in 2007, and since then have become internationally recognized leaders in contemplative care through the Zen Center's educational offerings and faculty appointments in medical fellowships. And now, of course, co-leading our own fellowship, the Contemplative Medicine Fellowship here at the Zen Center. So our format for tonight, and then I will turn it over to Dr. Brewer and Sensei Koshin. Our format for tonight is a free-range conversation between the two of them. I'll seed the conversation with an initial question, and then they will be in conversation with each other. I'll disappear off the screen, so I won't be facilitating in a panel style. But later I'll return with questions that we've curated from the viewers. You can submit those with the Q&A feature on Zoom. And I'll also share some information about the fellowship towards the end of the webinar. So Dr. Brewer, Sensei Koshin, welcome.
Thank you.
And maybe I'll frame the conversation as a starting point in this way. The event, again, is called Coming Home to Yourself, Flourishing in the Field of Medicine. And there's a lot to unpack there. But in the description of the event, we also talked about the possibility of the practice of medicine itself becoming a powerful practice of caring for ourselves as we care for others, rather than those being two separate things. And as you and our audience knows, the practice of medicine right now is incredibly challenging for most. High levels of depression, anxiety, emotional exhaustion, burnout, and many can't think of taking on something else, even if it would help them and their patients. And yet something needs to change. As you know, many are leaving the field. Those who remain are shutting down to themselves, to their patients, to their loved ones. And both of these are, devastating prospects for those who entered the field of medicine to be of service to others. So I think the beginning point is, how can contemplative medicine, or integrating contemplative approaches into the practice of medicine, help practitioners flourish and sustain a compassionate medicine practice? Big question.
Well, to me, one of the things that is so important is really looking at the practice of medicine and really reflecting on how we are inside of ourselves in our basic relationships and how we're then practicing medicine from that place. And I think that one of the ways that we have been really reflecting on with our fellows and just in living beings, just to be alive, is to really reflect on, like, how am I doing? How are my relationships inside of myself? How am I actually doing? And to have that kind of honest conversation with ourselves and really cultivating true relationships with other people who we could call fellows, or we could call friends or companions in this world. The people that if we live with someone, with that person, with our community, and so that when we go into our clinical work, that we can actually reflect on and go in feeling nourished. But I think it's really hard to do that when we're not feeling nourished or at home anywhere. Yeah. What do you think, Judd, my dear friend, Judd?
I agree with that. And I would just add, often what I see a lot of is when people aren't feeling nourished and, kind of their threat alarm is up. And so there's a lot of, I would just say their brains are trying to help with difficult situations, but they get stuck, they get shunted down these pathways that they're kind of more survival pathways, and then end up making it challenging for them, or even counter helpful, if that's a way to put a term together, not helpful, more harmful to them, where they start developing these habits of closing down, of callousness, of depersonalization, these things that are now described pretty clearly in these burnout inventories. And it's really interesting because they're just getting caught in these cycles of their brain just trying to help them survive. And then they're getting stuck in these moral dilemmas where it's like, my corporation is making me do something against what I think is the best care for my patient. And then the only coping mechanisms that they know are ones that don't help them, whether it's closing down, whether it's just, like not connecting with people. And so one place to start is really to help people start to understand how their minds work. And instead of fighting with themselves or not even knowing what's happening, but just automatically going with these kind of habitual instinctual responses, being able to step back, ground themselves, and just start to see what's happening first and learn what's happening. I guess one way to summarize that is, like, if we don't know how our mind works, there's no way we're going to be able to work with our mind. And so that's one place that we start, is just starting to help people get the lay of the land of how their mind works. And it can even be simple things like kind of understanding how empathy fatigue can even be a habitual process itself.
Can you actually, because to me, we talk about this and it's so important, but how do you actually do that? How do you begin to uncouple that addiction to even empathy fatigue, even to our own burnout? And so how do we, in a more kind of granular way, really think about and reflect on, how do I uncouple that dangerous and harmful pattern that I'm also participating in maintaining?
Yeah. Well, here I have learned so much from my patients who suffer from addiction. And one of the many things I've learned from them is to see what motivates change. And so often, I'm sure many people have heard this rock bottom. It is true. When somebody hits rock bottom, suddenly that motivation to change arises. And I think we can compassionately help people kind of see how they're kind of contributing to that suffering, their own suffering, because it provides two things. It provides, not necessarily kind of forces them to rock bottom, but it helps them see how painful it is when they're getting stuck in these processes. But at the same time, help them see that it's really important to understand the process, because then you're not feeling hopeless. So if it's a black box and they're like, this sucks, this is terrible, and I don't see any way out, yeah, it's going to suck. There's no getting around that. But if somebody sees, oh, this is really painful, and this is my habitual response to pain, right? Where it's something's painful, our brain says, go away, make this go away as quickly as possible, right? And if our brain says, make something go away as quickly as possible, do this, right? It's going to grab for the closest thing that it can use to help do that, which could be closing down, which could be, a number of different mechanisms that are then themselves adding to that pain. So I like to start with just kind of doing some inquiry with folks to really see, like, where is the suffering? And where is there some habitual response of the brain that is contributing to that suffering? Again, not their fault. And that's one thing I emphasize, like, hey, we're going to explore this. It's not your fault. If this is not on you, because people think there must be something wrong with me. Why can't I just armor up and, muscle through this?
Culture.
That culture was something that's been perpetuated from medical school on up, right? So we can start to change that culture by helping people see, oh, it's not your fault. This is your brain trying to help you, but it's kind of gone off track. And if you can just learn a few simple things, it can help you get back on track and even thrive.
What do you think, I think that to really reflect on what are those simple things that we can kind of just get back on track into, to me, it's also like what I was talking about before, about like, really, how am I having some sense of how are we nurturing the conditions of our own mental health, our spiritual health, and our relational health, right? To really reflect on, like, how is that going, and to have a humility around the response, right? Because I think that's the key part, like what you're saying, many people feel ashamed. And what I always try to encourage in myself and others is like, well, let's just be embarrassed about it, because it's embarrassing how we do things that are not helpful, right?
Yeah. Well, and I think if we can see that these are habitual patterns of the mind, we can also not take them so personally, because the embarrassment often comes out of some story we tell ourselves as to who we are, right? And it's like, oh, I shouldn't be that type of person. And so when I am, I'm embarrassed. But that's all ego-based. And so I like how you bring up humility, because if we can see this isn't about us in the sense of like, I'm a physician, but this is about us and the world and our patients, and this interconnection where we can come back to our basic principles of, I'm here to help, right? I took this Hippocratic oath to first do no harm. I'm going to take the Koshin oath of helping as well, right? But we can only take that oath when we have the resources and the grounding to be able to do that. So how do we do that? Well, we start to learn how we are habitually taking things personally, or putting ourselves in situations where we are kind of getting stuck in these loops, and then learning how to step out. Let's give a concrete example. I don't want this just to be some esoteric conversation. One thing that has really struck me when I really explored this years ago, one of the big pieces, I think, related to how some of these mindfulness practices can be helpful is just understanding the difference between empathy and compassion. Okay. So actually, let's have a conversation about this. So I think of empathy as pragmatically putting ourselves in our patient's shoes. And so if our patients are suffering and we're putting ourselves in their shoes, if we're going to empathize them, ipso facto, we are suffering. And let's say that we only work 60 hours a week. So we're only suffering 60 hours a week. There's a recipe for burnout because we are taking that suffering personally. And so we might think, well, but I have to put myself in their shoes to understand. No, there's an alternative way. Compassion, compassio literally means to suffer with. So I think of it as if we walk alongside, if we are with somebody's suffering, suddenly we can start to see, oh, this isn't about me. And when we aren't worried about protecting ourselves from that suffering, then we can actually lean into it because there's nobody there to protect. It's not about us. It's not about us protecting ourselves. It's not about us putting ourselves in their shoes. It's about, oh, here is suffering. And when we're in the presence of suffering and not approaching it from an ego-based manner, then what happens in the presence of suffering? Compassion arises. The movement to help naturally arises.
Yeah, it's like the kind of what the historical Buddha talked about. If we get just caught in our feeling, where we're kind of helpless in a certain way. And we're just kind of going downstream in that world of feeling and thought. And to me, what is so beautiful is what I see very often with the people that we have the privilege to work with, is that we learn together how to, climb out of that river and sit on the bank of it and look out and realize, oh my goodness, I'm not just my exhaustion. And I'm not just my burnout. I'm not just my resentment and bitterness. I actually can look up and realize what else is happening in my life and in this world. And it's such a like an amazing thing, it's so rare. And I think that to me, I'm curious actually about in your work, because one of the things I think about when I think about you, Judd, is actually the first time I met you, I remember thinking like, wow, I don't know who that is, but like, I'm just digging that vibe, and just wanted to sit together with you and go for a walk because there was just a sense of connection and warmth, and you were actually there. And so I think that there's also, to me, learning how to build companionship and moving out of our isolated river. But even sometimes climbing out of that by ourselves exacerbates the problem sometimes.
Yeah.
We get out and we still feel lonely.
Yeah.
And how do we find our people? Because actually, as we know, a lonely monkey is a dead monkey, that we need each other.
Yeah. Well, just extending your river analogy, I think it's a nice one. And it's even one. So in some of the research that we've done around like how can we in very simple ways help physicians with improve their resilience. And so we did a study with this 7-part podcast on my podcast. It's free. Anybody can listen to it on the Dr. Judd podcast. But the idea was 15 minutes, people can, if they're commuting to work for 15 minutes or longer, they can do this 7-part course and got really nice results. But the reason I mention that is that in one of the modules, we talk about this difference between empathy and compassion, and we actually use a river analogy. And so imagine if somebody is in a river and they're getting washed downstream, and we're like, oh, I have to help, and we jump in the stream to try to save them, we could drown as well. And then there are 2 people lost.
Right.
But if we're able to step back and really see, oh, there is someone there, and we're not caught up in the situation like, oh no, what do I do? We can say, oh, here's a rope or a vine or something. I'm going to throw them the rope. And that way we can help them and not get dragged downstream ourselves. And so, highlighting how we can step away from the stories, taking things personally, and by stepping away, we can actually start to feel into what it feels like to be with suffering. And just as an example, in the, in just 7 short modules, we've seen, increases in self-compassion, decreases in, anxiety and things like that, because when people don't take these things personally, it frees up all that energy of, anxiety is really energy draining. It frees it up so that they can actually use it in ways that are skillful. So going back to your loneliness piece, another habit that we see a lot is people closing down and isolating themselves. And there can be components where they're like, I don't want to burden other people. I'm supposed to be the one that's providing care, and why, and we don't learn that self-care is just as important as other care. And so that's a habitual reaction that's just like, well, or I'm just too tired. Like I just can't do anything else. And so the habitual reaction is to close down. If we can start to see very clearly that is not helping us, right? That is what's kind of washing us down the river. That helps motivate us to see, oh, there are other ways. There are other ways that I can be. And then we can also start to reflect on, have that energy to reflect on what's it like to be in relationship with colleagues, for example. And so one thing I love about the fellowship is that it creates fellowship, right? And so these are folks that can connect with each other, they can relate to each other, and they can support each other.
Yeah, I think that one of the things, there's just this incredible sorrow that needs to be appreciated, at least for me, and to feel that so many go into this field to be a help, to be, a caring person in a very particular way. And I was actually just talking to my primary care physician today, and he was just talking about wow, how rough, the system is, and how important it was for him to return to community, to return to what matters most. And so I think that in some ways, like what you're saying and what you would help people do, and what the fellowship helps people to do, is we actually need fellowship, and we actually need, not as a notch in our belt of a subspecialty, but actually just need people who we feel actually hear us and see us and care. And I think it also, you were talking about self-care, it's the problem that Chodo and I have seen for years is that people always said, because we're monks, I think people confess to us and they say oh, I'm really bad at my self-care. I'm really bad at my self-care. Or they say, oh, I'm really bad. Now they say, I'm really bad at my self-compassion. And so it's because I think in some ways those things have been seen as a remedy, go do it yourself.
Right.
So care, you go somewhere and get a mani-pedi or take a yoga class, as if that's what care is. So really learning how to nourish ourselves in a much deeper way, to really think about the depth of our care and compassion that includes ourselves, is the depth of compassion and care that we offer others, right? So if we're going to come home in medicine, I think it has to be really reflecting what medicine means.
Yeah. And, I want to highlight something that you said around the self-care. Often we all know what we should do to care for ourselves, right? Eat healthy food, exercise, sleep the right amount. The College of Lifestyle Medicine has kind of nailed, some 8 pillars that are pretty straightforward. And if you look at them, you're like, duh, of course. And then we're like, wow, that's a list of 8 things that I don't have time to do. So then what do? We judge ourselves for not being able to to do the self-care. And so if we see it as a list of things that we just need to accomplish, which is often the way that people go through medical school and residency in life. It's like, well, here are my prerequisites for medical school. And so check, 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 check. There's my list. Got into medical school. Here's what I need to get in residency. Check, 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 check. Okay, here's what I need for fellowship. Here's what I need to get a good job. And we don't step back and look, and like, we're just making that next list. Well, here's what I need to do to care for myself. Check, 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 check. Oh, I don't have time to do this. Then we're defeating the whole purpose, and we're actually making it worse because we're feeling bad that we can't care for ourselves. And so here, I think even stepping back and making this very pragmatic, where it's like, okay, one thing that I like to do is really bring things into the clinic and say, okay, this doesn't take you any extra time because you don't have time. I'm going to assume you don't have time. I'm going to assume you have negative time. Right? You have anti-time, right? So if you have anti-time, let's work with that. So we start with like, let's learn something on your drive to work. Let's implement it in the clinic. And it could be as simple as just recognizing a habit loop, where it could be the over-empathizing habit loop, where it's like you take your patients home with you, right? So if somebody's driving home and they're worried about their patient, that worrying, I can almost promise, isn't going to cure their patient. It might actually make things worse because they're going to burn out and not be able to care for patients if they're burnt out. So they can start to recognize it. Oh, okay. In that moment, they can recognize that loop, and then they can start to learn to work with it. Or it's like the frustration loop where, somebody gets frustrated. There are a billion things we can get frustrated about. It doesn't even matter whether it's something in the system, some interaction we had with a patient. And then we're spending all this time kind of backpedaling because we yelled at our staff or something, my frustration habit loop shows up quite a bit on certain calls when I'm calling customer support for something that's broken. I need to practice some compassion. It's like, it's not their fault that my thing is broken. Oh, I'm frustrated. And then instead of like apologizing to them at the end of the call because I felt terrible, that I was like, and be like, oh, okay, this sucks. We both know it sucks. How do we work with this, right? And so that's how we can learn to repurpose that energy, just by simply recognizing that we're stuck, whether it's frustration, whether it's over-empathizing, whether it's putting our head down and charting at night instead of spending time with our family as a way to like not deal with with our spouse saying, why aren't you spending more time with your family? We're like, I have to chart. This is saving lives, like probably doing your EMR catch up isn't going to save somebody's life, but that's the story we tell ourselves. Mm-hmm. Then we get stuck. Oh, now we have relationship issues. What do we do there? We isolate even more, and then we just spiral out of control. So I think a lot can be done with the circumstances without adding more to the you should, Mm-hmm. I love the joke, we should all over ourselves, right? Not helpful.
No. Well, it's also so interesting because, many people, for example, come to the fellowship say like, oh, I don't have time for that. Mm-hmm. But actually what they find is that by carving out time that actually where the experience in that time feels nourishing. Yeah. So like that we often are not being so selective, as you're saying, like what we're actually doing in our time. And all we have is time, as we know. And, the other thing I just was thinking about, one of our alumni, they described coming into the fellowship just like kind of like crawling in, and because they felt like they were crawling home from the hospital and not having time for their partner and their kids, and they described, I think they're here tonight, so but they described just like one time during the fellowship just like sitting and watching the washing machine, just like the clothes, and how beautiful it was. And just like to take that time instead of just like running to the next thing, just like, wow, check that out. And I think in general, I know for myself, I'm actually curious about in your own experience as Judd. Yeah. Like, for example, I used to get up later. But then I started to find out that like, wow, if I set myself up really differently in the morning, so like now I get up very early so that I can meditate, so that I go to the gym and cook a nice breakfast for myself and sit down and enjoy some matcha or whatever it is, and by that time, so now by 8 o'clock in the morning, I feel so ready and so enlivened, where I used to think I didn't have time. And my day was too full to go to the gym. My day was too full to meditate for 30 minutes in the morning before I come here, so all of these stories, but it didn't turn out to be true, because actually now I feel I have much more energy than I ever have.
Mhm.
So I'm curious about in the life of Judd, if you'd be willing to share.
I'd be happy to. And I think, just to summarize, if I'm understanding what you're saying, it's kind of like we don't have time not to take the time to care for ourselves, because there's a return on investment, let's put it that way, if we care for ourselves, because we are investing not only in ourselves, which can feel selfish at first until we see this isn't about me, this is about all of us, right? I'm making this dualistic distinction that's really just a story. And so we can say, well, I shouldn't care for myself. Or we could say, wait a minute, if I care for this body and mind can help others more and can connect with others more and can help the world more. And so here, I my own life, it has become, it's become a habit, because I just can't imagine not doing it. So for example, eating healthy food has been so clearly different than eating crappy food. I think of like this food mood relationship. Feel like crap, you eat crap, you're going to feel like crap, right? So what I find is that I have so much more energy to bring to the day if I care for myself with food that way, and take the time to prepare food. It actually doesn't take that long to eat healthy food, right? So that's one piece. Making sure that I am getting sleep and seeing what gets in the way of that, in terms of like, well, if I'm checking my email, what's the result of that, versus if I'm like letting those emails wait until tomorrow morning and I'm getting some sleep. What I find is if I don't try to do something late at night, I'm actually being much more efficient at responding to emails in the morning, and not backpedaling when I've screwed something up or said something in a way that could have been said more skillfully. The mental self-care is kind of a no-brainer. I remember a student asking me once, like in all earnestness, they're like, what if you just stopped meditating for a week? And my brain was like, why would I do that? Because it's just such a no-brainer to bring that awareness piece in as a foundational support. Mm-hmm. And also see that this doesn't necessarily require like sitting for 2 hours at a time, but to bring it into each moment. It's like, oh, in this moment, can I be aware, versus when I'm not aware, and which one feels better? No brainer. Again, it's like, oh, this awareness is such a gift that we can not only give to ourselves, but to everyone when we are more aware. And it's not something we have to put on our to-do list. It's something that we can just simply remember any moment, right? I love that translation of sati, the Pali word for mindfulness is to remember or remembering, right? So this isn't some like, oh, I have to do this. Anything have to is not mindfulness. But if we can really understand and feel into what it's like to be aware, then our brain's like, ooh, that's good. Why don't you do that a little bit more? Okay, how about a little bit more? How about a little bit more? And then it's like, dude, why are you not doing this?
Yeah, dude.
Not what's wrong with you, but like, hey, let's drop in.
Right.
To this moment.
But it's, I'm just so curious too, because we know that it does feel good. Like when we in Zen practice, we value experience much more than what we think or feel about it, right? And in the same way, like if you really drop into your experience, it does tend to feel really good when you're really present and engaged and nourished, right? But so
Well, actually, and let me add something to that for that, I can hear my skeptical, mind saying,
that's where I was
well,
going.
okay, perfect. Yeah, we are mind synced yet again. So the mind's like, well, what if it's uncomfortable? What if it's a terrible time, right? So here, instead of running away from it or pushing it away, we can learn to explore, like, well, what's it like if I open to this suffering? And for me, opening to it, that non-resistance piece, even when it sucks, I'm adding suckage onto it when I'm resisting it, right? And so that part's optional, right? That's that 2 arrow thing that guy, the Buddha, nailed, right?
Yeah.
That's it. And we can see this in real life. It's like, oh, when I heap suffering on, I'm suffering even more. When there is suffering and I'm not taking it personally and I'm not resisting, resistance is taking something personally. It's our ego saying, I don't want that.
Right.
And then
it's exhausting.
totally, absolutely. That's where burnout comes from.
Right. And then we blame other people for it. Or the system. Like,
well, and it's not to say that the system doesn't need to change. I think we're probably all in agreement there, so we don't need to. But so it's not necessarily, because often people say, oh, these mindfulness practices are about, gaslighting physicians and saying you have to change, our system doesn't have to change. What I say is, if we can work with ourselves and we can learn to free up that energy, then we can march against the institution and institute change, instead of saying, I'm so burnt out, I don't have time, I don't have the energy to do this.
Exactly. It's so exciting, isn't it?
So there is hope. That's the summary, And I'll just say, the more we can learn how our mind works, the more we can learn to work with our mind, and then even put our minds to work for us.
And knowing that we'll keep forgetting and keep remembering, and we can help each other to remember.
Yes.
What matters most.
And that's compassion.
Thank you.
Somebody's
Thank you both. I have returned. Thank you so much for the conversation so far. We've been collecting some questions here. Many of them I think you've been answering along the way, but a few have come in just now I thought we would start with. First is from an anonymous attendee. I think you touched on this, but there's something here perhaps to elaborate on. What are the concrete steps I can take to prevent over-empathizing with patients and having worries interrupt non-work activities?
Yes. So it's, I wish I could say and done, but that's why we put together this 7-part course. And so, if anybody wants to try that, it's free. Brown even gives a CME course for that course, so you can get CME credits for free. So I would say check that out. But the high level is, we've got to understand what the over-empathizing habit loop is. We've got to be able to see how it's not rewarding for our brain. And then we've got to see where there's a way out, a way to step out of that habit loop. And we touched briefly on it around being with suffering rather than taking that suffering personally. And we actually talk about that in the second module. So folks can find it on the Dr. Judd podcast or at Brown's CME. And maybe David, we can share that with folks or post that in the chat. And I would also say there's this fellowship that probably teaches some of this as well. But I think you're going to talk about that in a few minutes.
Well, I think it's also just kind of, to me, it goes back to finding your people, right? And so that how it becomes sustaining by having, like that we were saying about having people who can compassionately respond to you when you're going to get stuck. Because no matter what we do the fellowship, we do your wonderful course or whatever that is. And then after, what do we do? And so like, that's what I've been seeing with our fellows after the fellowship, like they're continuing to support each other, continuing to help remember together, like, oh wait, we can easily go back into old habit patterns and we can do something new.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Thank you. This question comes from Susan, who asks, or who says, hello, I'm in my 25th year of doing primary care in a small clinic, seemingly the most personal one-on-one care of one individual after another, and I am lonely. Medicine, primary care, is so lonely. Can you say something about professional loneliness?
Well, first, Susan, thank you for just putting that out there, because I think a lot of folks don't want to admit this to themselves. It's like, well, I'm with people all day. What's going on? What's wrong with me? So thank you for just naming that loneliness. And I would say, I'm curious, Koshin, what you would say here, but I would just start by saying that as we can start to ask, where is that loneliness? And often that comes from having people not feeling like there are folks that get where we're coming from, right? That have been in those shoes, that have walked that path. And so, for example, in the program that we teach, one of the most common comments that we get is, "Oh, I'm so glad I'm not alone." Because they hear other people's stories, and I'm sure you get this in your fellowship, and they're like, "Oh, it's not just me." And that's where that loneliness bubble starts to burst. Like, oh, there's fellowship right here. It's often hard to find fellow travelers, especially for busy working all day in a small clinical practice or something like that. And I think that's starting to change now that we have opportunities to connect virtually. Things like Zoom calls are amazing in terms of helping people be able to connect all over the world. So no matter where they are geographically, they can still connect with folks that get where they're coming from.
Yeah, I mean, I think that, many of our fellows have been in primary care, and also I think, what was the percentage of the last year? Like 40% or 35% of Americans describe themselves as lonely. Even many of them actually are in relationships and have families. So sometimes it's lonelier being with people that you don't know how to connect to or don't feel connected to. And so I think there's two things. One is, how do we nourish ourselves in our inside of our life, inside of our mind and our spirit? How are we tending to that? How are we really putting the effort into building relationships so that we're going out for lunch and seeing friends and cultivating friends? And because those are just so essential. And this research is very, very clear, especially from the beautiful Harvard study. It's about the regularity in which you see people really matters. And so really making an effort to see friends regularly. And if you don't have, learning how to make some friends and I think the other part of it is that, how are you connecting in your clinical work too? As a clinician myself, like I find myself in deep love with the people that I work with, as I see it as like I'm a care partner with them, and so really learning how to be loving. And so that actually I do feel very together and not alone. And I think that even in the average doctor's visit is 3 minutes, and there's so much you can do in 3 minutes where you can actually connect and just be like, I remember my first doctor, Marty, and when I went to see him for the first time in primary care, and he just said, I just have a few minutes, but let's sit down and just look at each other for a minute. He's like, I want to just take you in.
Lovely.
And I was like, wow. So there are ways, and we have to learn and really put the effort into making new patterns and new habits and new rituals. And to see, to me, it's like that we have the opportunity, this rare opportunity to see our life as a ceremony, that we can actually bring what is deeply meaningful and valuable to everything that we do. That's what's on the table, but rarely eaten.
I was also reminded of hearing from our alumni of the fellowship who we were shocked to find out that they're basically like chatting with each other. A year and a half ago they graduated, and they chat with each other every day, sharing what's going on, and that sense of community, and the comments we've gotten about feeling closer to each other than they feel with the colleagues they worked for or with for 10 years plus, and the power of that as well. A question from Dana. Thank you for this beautiful offering. I'm wondering about how to balance being in the moment with others and caring for self. For example, extra time with a suffering patient that is nourishing to both them and myself, but pulls me away from family or results in less sleep, etc. How do we know where to set limits?
It's a wonderful question. And I think this comes back to the theme of this evening, which is coming home to ourselves. And so here, if we can be open to ourselves as feedback, right? We as humans learn best from feedback. And so if we can learn to tune into ourselves and not ignore our needs, then, there's no formulaic answer. It's like, it's not like a medical textbook where it's like, if you spend 14 seconds on this and then 28 seconds on this, we will start to learn into what is in the moment most skillful, because each moment is different, but we can draw upon our wisdom, based on, like, okay, are my batteries charged, right? Okay, this could be, this would be a time where, what's it like when I spend a little extra time versus when my batteries aren't charged and I'm doing this in a way that's like probably not as easily accessible for us to truly be present, especially if we're thinking, I got to get home, I got to get, I promised my family this and I promised that. So if we can recognize all those patterns and then start to listen to our bodies, there's a huge amount of wisdom that's just going to come forth. And then we start to trust ourselves more, which is often hard to do at the beginning.
Such an important, I love what you were sharing, Judd. And I just was thinking about myself when I was working in an inpatient oncology unit, and I was about to go on a 5-week retreat, and I felt this enormous guilt. And for leaving them, because most of them, their health was very fragile, and many of them probably would not be there when I came back. And it was a really important time for me to really reflect on, what am I doing? And this retreat is so important for me. And actually, it is what is teaching me how to show up more fully and more lovingly and more compassionately in a 360 kind of way. And so I remember going around and having these conversations with these people who I loved, and I can still see their faces, and just saying, this is what I'm doing. And if you want to see each other again, you got to hang on. And if not, just know, like, we were just able to close it, just to say like that we've done what we've been able to do, and really take the time to say we've been able to do what we've been able to do, and kind of recounting some of the beautiful work that we were able to do together. and honoring that. But that's what we had in the time that we had. And we don't have infinite time. So it was really beautiful. And it felt like an incredibly important pivot for myself, actually, in this work and how I understand compassion.
Yeah.
Well, unfortunately, we're coming to the end of our time together, and I want to save a little bit of time for the two of you to offer closing remarks. But first, I want to mention a few things. We've had a few questions about the fellowship, and so I wanted to share that we will be emailing you about the fellowship. So no need to take notes, but I believe Mayar, who is our online programs manager and behind the scenes with us tonight, he will also be chatting some information into Zoom as I talk about it. So the Contemplative Medicine Fellowship is a 12-month training for physicians, advanced practice registered nurses, and physician assistants who want to integrate and apply a contemplative approach to their practice of medicine. It's designed to support the existing responsibilities of those practicing as clinicians, medical educators, researchers, administrators, or leaders, and sustaining a practice of compassionate medicine and addressing the real and significant challenges of caring for a suffering world. So the application process is open. If you're a physician, nurse practitioner, or physician assistant, applications are being accepted now on a rolling basis for the fellowship, which begins in July. We do have some scholarships available. We're pleased to offer a limited number of partial scholarships, focusing on supporting candidates who are identified as Black, Indigenous, or people of color, as well as people primarily working with underserved communities. So I think if he hasn't already, Mayar will chat the fellowship link there. If you're not one of those professions, but still interested in a similar training, we have our Foundations in Contemplative Care, which is a 9-month program for any profession or people of no profession who are interested in exploring their relationship to themselves and others through a contemplative approach to care. Applications are also being accepted for that. And finally, you can visit and learn more about the Zen Center at our website, zencare.org, and reach one of us on staff at info@zencare.org. So thank you all for joining us. And Dr. Brewer and Sensei Koshin. Oh, and we will be sharing about Judd's work. We got questions about that, and Judd, we will include that in our follow-up email. Forgot to mention that. To both of you, thank you, and closing remarks for those who have joined today.
I'll just say, if folks want more information, they can just visit my website, drjud.com, drjud.com. But I think the closing remarks I would say is that really explore in that this idea that self-compassion is self-care is a radical act of self and other compassion. It's really a radical act of compassion for all beings. Self-care is a radical act of compassion for all beings. That's how I would end.
I would just say life is so short, and all we have is the time that we have. And as the Shakyamuni Buddha talked about, that, our actions are our only true belongings, that what we do. And so if you're hesitating to make change, I just encourage you to reflect on, do you really need to hesitate? Do you really? Do I really? Sometimes we do, but it's good to ask the question, do I really need to? And as the evening gatha that we chant, here at the Zen Center every night, which says, let me respectfully remind you, life and death are of supreme importance. Time swiftly passes by and opportunities are lost. Each of us must strive to awaken, take heed, do not squander your life. So I'm just feeling full of love, full of gratitude for you, Judd, for all of us gathering here. And thank you, Itzi, and Mayor for shepherding all of us. And life is sweet and always can be a bit more delicious if you taste it completely.
Thank you both. Good night, everyone.
Good night, everyone. And Judd, when's the walk happening? When you
Soon
come
as
back,
possible.
go for a stroll.
I would love it.
Me too.